This is a Posthuman Podcast, Season 3. I'm your host, Dr. Timothy K. Turner. We've got some great music coming up from The Going Rate. Check those out. Remember to give some comments, good or bad. Hit that notification, subscribe. We've got some great stuff coming up at the end of the month. I hope you enjoy the show, people. Thank you. So, today's guest, best-selling author, speaker and teacher, Melissa Kim Corter. So, how are you today?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thank you. I'm pretty good. So I'm going to try and keep this show serious. My last one was on a Friday, very, very loose. I'll try and be a bit more professional this time. So let's just get into what you do. Coming across and doing my research, I found this very hard to even get a few questions, so it will be a bit loose. But there's some very intriguing stuff that I'd like to crack on with. But first of all, let's get into your journey. Obviously, you have 30 certifications, which is a phenomenal amount. So let's start about your journey. How did you get into doing what you do?
Well, it's been a lifetime of exploration. I started out as a seeker, always had this curious nature about me, and I was honestly just a very strange and odd child. So I didn't really fit in a lot of places, and I think that was sort of the key that led me to want to get out into the world and find other people that had some of the unique, strange experiences that I had. And honestly, deeper than that, it was just this journey of trying to figure out, like, what is wrong with me? Why am I so different? Ultimately, fast forward years later, coming around full circle to realize that thing that I didn't connect with, or I didn't understand, or that part of me that other people didn't necessarily understand, was something I had to learn to embrace. And now it's a foundational piece in my work, and an authentic part of just learning to really trust what makes us different from other people and viewing that as an asset.
Of course. I mean, you've got a master's in depth psychology.
Mhm.
Can you just briefly explain what that is? I've not heard of that myself, and I look into all sorts of stuff. So when I come across that, I was like, interesting. I've not really heard of that. And
Yeah,
so,
I love it. I love it. So depth psychology, there's so many different types of psychology, obviously, in the world. There's a lot of different theories and backgrounds and all of that stuff. And just cutting right into the heart of it, depth psychology tends to the soul. It includes the soul instead of keeping it out of whether it's the therapy, the approach, the tradition. It's this idea that there's this deeper navigating part of us that is a part of the psyche. And we end up working with that just as much as we would the persona or the ego or the other typical parts that you usually hear in reference to the mind and the unconscious part of self.
of course, I mean, so it's, I mean, not that it's like a less ethical approach, but is it more of a less, medicinal? Because if you're talking psychology, I mean, that's all over the place anyway. If you look
Right.
back, if you look back in history, none of those techniques would be even relevant today. Phrenology and shit like that. So, you know, it's just something that I've never heard of, and it's one of those things. I've never really thought about the soul when it comes to psychology.
Right. It's interesting too, because if you look back to some of the earlier work of people like Carl Jung, even Sigmund Freud, who catches a lot of flack for some of his theories, it's interesting because the word soul was actually really prevalent throughout a lot of the material. But when the translation happened, it was lost. So they actually cut the word soul out to try to be more scientific, to try to be more professional, more analytical. And so over the years, depth psychology, it's sort of a tradition in a way where it's just finding these ways of bringing soul back in. And soul doesn't have one definition either. It's a very open to interpretation sort of experience. It's just really tending to that deeper part of us. We might identify with it as the part of us that sort of just knows our personal morals, our truth, that inner compass. It's also non-denominational, so it does not have to be put in a box as far as a certain tradition goes. That's one of the things that I love about it. It's really about just getting in touch with something within the individual that they can resonate with and work with when they go through dark times or challenge.
Well, I mean, most people, when they think of the soul, it's like, when you die, it's going to go somewhere. Christians, obviously, that's, the heaven route. But, some people nowadays mostly think that it's going to a different plane or this different dimension. And it's strange because I don't really think about the soul that often. I think we have one. I don't know what will ever happen in terms of when we die. I don't think anyone can ever guess that. But it's weird when you sit there and think about it. When I was doing a few notes, I was sitting there thinking, this is why I couldn't really get many questions because I was sitting there going, about the soul. I've never really sat and thought about it. And what kind of things do you think makes up, a soul? Because when you said it from your points of view, and obviously I've got my horrible old school point of view, um, what do you think sort of you could define the human soul as now?
I tend to look at the natural world for a lot of my answers and my way of sort of walking through this life experience. And when I think of soul, I see it reflected back through the natural world. So for me, it's this deeper sense of interconnectivity. It isn't something that you can necessarily capture. I think of it also similar to electricity, right? We all know that we are paying for electricity to run through our homes, right? It's just a part of our daily experience. But when do we actually sit back and think about, like, what is electricity? How do you capture it? How do you hold on to it? How do you describe it? It's an energetic force in a way. We know that it works. We know there's end results to it. We know it can be powerful and dangerous. Yet at the same time, we actually look at the devices that allow electricity to move through them versus that essence itself. And so I kind of think of our human body as a similar way. I don't want to call it a device. I don't want to be that
I know what you
just,
mean.
but it's sort of this beautiful containment of whatever that is, that source, that soul. And I like to leave that a little open-ended because I think one of the problems we face in this world is we try to reduce everything down to a simple form, and then we wonder why there's no more magic, connectivity, enchantment in our lives. So I feel like the soul is sort of this ominous experience, presence that's unique to each individual. But I also see it in synchronistic moments. That to me is when there's an alignment of, let's just say, my humanness, my mind, my ego, all the things, and something deeper all of a sudden for me just comes into this alignment, and I have this moment. It might even be an aha moment, but synchronicity is a great way to sort of get close to that interesting, ominous part of us without, but there's still mystery to it. There's still this like, what is that? What was that? So that's how I like to be the soul.
I mean, it's interesting. I think you are right. We are kind of vessels for this, spiritual energy. I totally believe in that. It's like auras and stuff like that. I kind of almost connect the soul to that in a way.
Sure.
Because there's good and bad people in the world, and obviously I believe that if you're a bad person, your soul's probably pretty doomed.
Right.
And that's all in most religions anyway. But in terms of viewing it as I believe it is. But it's again, you can't really see it, you can't capture it. There's no real explanation for it. So to study it is it's very tricky. You don't, it's hard. But it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And I think you are right in the fact that life has kind of lost a lot of magic. It's lost. I mean, I think it's coming back in a way.
Yeah.
I think for a brief bit of time. I mean, things tend to shift anyway.
True.
And lately, well, it's funny because the other day I was reading an article about a university that was opening witchcraft courses, which is, that's pretty interesting in itself.
Yeah.
My opinion on that, I don't know. It'd be interesting to do the course, but you couldn't do that like 20 years ago.
Right.
And these it's almost like there's two poles that are constantly shifting, and I think that happens all the time. And I think this magic is kind of coming back. This what people think as since COVID, most people have thought on themselves, and the media keeps trying to shove things at people.
Right.
But a lot of people have found their true selves, good or bad.
Right.
A lot of it is bad, but a lot of people found their true selves, and some people have delved into little holes and stuff that they shouldn't. But some of it is like it's like the conspiracy theorists, some of that bullshit. But
Yeah.
but a lot of people have gone more spiritual, and like Burning Man. That's a big festival. I believe it's still about spirituality, but huge thing. And I think it's sort of on the rise, but it's just in a different fashion to what it used to be in terms of we've only studied it from old religious texts or stuff like that, whereas or conspiracy theorists about Hollywood witches, and that's a whole different level.
About 4 more episodes. Deal with that.
Yeah, there's geez, but no, it's but apart from that, I do believe that there's a lot more spirituality. A lot more people are thinking about themselves, and it's definitely something that is a good career to get into in a way, because business, a lot of businesses are going out as well, which there's got to be these holes to fill. If there's no shops, people are going to turn inwards anyway.
Right.
That's going to create some sort of funnel where out of that come, people like yourself. Obviously, you got way more certifications than what most of these new people are getting into it, but it definitely creates this this not like a cult, but a big tribe of people that really do want to know more about the human nature and who they are. But yeah, that's a little tangent there. Sorry.
No, that's great. That ties in. That ties into all of this work that we do, especially in depth psychology. It's a turning inward. And you named it very beautifully by stating, sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's not. And there's this idea like when we turn inward, what are we looking at? What are we facing? And it doesn't mean also that if what's coming up or coming out is intense or awful, isn't necessary on some level. And again, I don't like to try to find meaning in everything all the time, but I do think that COVID was a catalyst and helping people become a bit more reflective, like you said, to, if we can't go into the stores or the markets or different things, everything was shut down, events, whatever, social interaction was basically halted. And for some, that was, especially like myself as an introvert, that was a blessing. I was like, thank God, finally,
It
but
made no real difference to me.
yeah, exactly. But for others, it was absolutely devastating. The severing of connections, of the daily routine, and so part of what we do in depth psychology is allow all of that. And instead of trying to sort of cut out the bad, it's like, how can we look at this and get a deeper understanding of it? And so that's why one of my favorite things, it's not comfortable and it's not easy, but I love exploring the dark side of the human psyche because it does contain a lot of information and insight for us, if we're willing to look at that. And like you just did, taking COVID and looking at it through this multifaceted lens instead of, man, that was a really rough time, and kind of leaving it there. It's like, sure, it was. And what came out of that? There were amazing businesses started. There were people who just walked away from things that they maybe didn't have the courage to do before that time. I didn't go back to school until COVID hit. And I said, it's now or never. I'm in my 40s and I'm not going to wait another 10 years to go back to school to get this degree. So there is a lot of good. And how do we look at what isn't so great? And how do we use that to, whether it's inform our decisions or open up other avenues of, showing us what's needed in the world and how to help people.
Well, I mean, going back to that, when about the connections, I think a lot of people don't have that either nowadays. Especially even in terms of having a stable environment, having two decent parents, that is very tricky to find nowadays. That is very, very rare. And there's just all these little common causes. It's like nature versus nurture. Well, at the moment, that's a very hard thing to grasp. Which one's kind of making these people?
Right.
Because society's pretty fucked, but then
Right.
also your home environment's also not that far off either for some people. Obviously there's the genetics behind that, or some people could genetically just end up being terrible.
Sure.
But a lot of it, I don't know where the world's shifting in terms of that. It's very strange, but I feel like there's just so many people are very disconnected as well.
Right.
It gave a lot of people time to self-reflect. It gave a lot of people time to look into shit as well. I've always been a big conspiracy fan. I've even since a kid, so it's not something that I've just got into. But during COVID, I started a podcast, and then I was like, man, I'll talk about a few of these conspiracies because I've been looking into it for ages. And some people just did other things. They just completely drove themselves inward. Alcoholism, another bad one.
Addiction, for sure.
I mean, I drink and smoke, but not to excessive levels. I'll have that on camera and blank that out because sometimes I have a little drink. More so, a Friday show. But it's just all about self-control as well. And during these moments, people just don't really have any lately. They're just constantly run by social media. They've got zero attention span. Also, that's the other thing. It's really tricky. I was talking to a friend the other day, and I've just recently got on TikTok, and he was saying, the best way to do it is 15-second videos. I'm like, that's almost impossible for me. I'll start talking, bang, I'm going for hours, and I can't. turn that into this small, narrow section of the pie chart. But it's just, there's so many. I'm not saying it's also bad, because I think there's also something good to that in a way. Because a lot of people are going, well, it's just, why am I going to watch these 15-second clips? And then it's given a market for other people that, do long form conversations, which are also, I believe, are way, way better for people. It gives a broader aspect to people as well. You was talking earlier about the dark side of human nature. I also love to look into like criminal stuff. I was going to do criminology years ago. It was a bit too hectic in my life at that time. Didn't really follow through with it. Big mistake. It's one of the big mistakes and regrets of my life, but you can only learn from that. But even then, most of the time I'm watching true crime stuff. I'm a big fan. Recently, during the Halloween, because it's Halloween season, I watch loads of very, very dark stuff. It's the only time of the year I do. But lately, I've really got into like predator catching videos, and they're really, really interesting because, I've got kids myself, so it's interesting to go, oh, I'd never suspect a guy looking like that.
Right.
And and it really does open your eyes. But it's hard. Obviously, sometimes they're hard to get through.
Absolutely.
But like anything, if you don't get through it, are you ever going to be aware of the dangers?
Right. That's one of the reasons I do study the dark side of the human psyche, is just differentiating these things. The rise of psychopaths in the world is pretty insane. It's frightening to think about. But at the same time, if we don't think about these things, talk about these things, we can't bring them into the light. And what I mean by that is not literally, but psychologically, we keep it buried. And then what happens is these things just are amplified or exaggerated. So if we start kind of chipping away at some of these experiences, I think there's enormous value there. Some of my clients and students think I'm a little crazy, which I've made peace with. It's fine. But I actually talk about the value in psychological thrillers, watching horror movies. It does something enormously powerful for the psyche. It helps us to process and to discharge different types of energy. You mentioned, COVID and some of the alcoholism and addiction. And what we got to see during that time in different ways, obviously throughout the world, is an amplification of these deeper impulses. And there was no distraction necessarily with being able to go out or do things. People were really under this microscope with their fears, and all of this stuff was coming up. And that was one way that there's a lot of different ways to look at that and work with it. And then you mentioned the nature versus nurture, which is obviously always ongoing, never ever going to go away. But something really interesting about that I actually learned recently, because I'm the same as you. I watch a lot of that stuff. That's how it'll be like, oh, it's Halloween season. I'm like, no, it's just a random Tuesday. But
I'll admit it gets a bit more darker during the Halloween season.
During that season.
Normally, I look into a lot of shit. It's it's very tricky, but sorry, carry on.
yeah, it's helpful, though. It's beneficial for certain individuals, of course. But something I learned recently was around that conversation of nature and nurture. And there used to be, maybe about a couple of years back, a time when they would interchange the word sociopath with psychopath, and they were very much sort of the same. And now what they're saying, and this isn't like a hard, solid fact or anything like that, it's just a theory, is that the psychopath is born and the sociopath might be made.
Yep.
And I sort of resonate with that a little bit through, the studies that I've seen and different research and things, that I could see where that would be important. And if we think about that social part, and like you said, also the home setting is shifting for people. We've never had it necessarily in a place where everyone had the perfect home or anything, but I definitely think there's been a exaggeration of all of these things with the rising problems and issues that COVID did put a magnifying glass on. And so there are these conditions now that are really ripe for those types of dangers in the personality. And if we know what to look for and stop watering it down, I feel like we can really help a lot of people. Instead of trying to normalize things like, what is it? It's antisocial personality disorder. Well, that sounds like, anything we all have. But when you break it down, it's kind of frightening that this is a cluster of what these people tend to have. These people that are, for a lack of a better way of saying it, like devoid of soul, or that deep empathy. The part that makes us deeply human, that empathy is just not there. And we have to be careful with that, with the information. There's this term I've been just loving lately. It's not a new term. It's been around forever, but it's called hermetic intoxication. And it basically means like this, right? This overwhelming amount of information that's coming at us with technology and all the things that we have. And it's a blessing, but we're not assimilating, we're not integrating. And then we wonder why we're all kind of flustered and walking around a little bit dazed and confused, which then disorients us to being able to trust intuition or soul, whatever you want to call that, to recognize when we're in the presence of those types of frightening individuals. So that's where like the heart of my work is these days, writing about that and thinking about it and how can I make it less terrible. I mean, there's not really a way to make it less terrible, but how can you present it to people so that they realize like, wow, I don't want to turn away from this. I want to feel more connected and present, so that you can pick up on the subtleties, especially when someone looks normal, which is part of the frightening part of that, and trust your instinct to say, I may not know what this is with this person, but something feels off. And we're going to miss that if we're distracted, if we're overwhelmed, if we're pulled in a million pieces.
Well, I mean, it's really tricky. Just going back to what you just said, I think a lot of people are so dissociated as well when it comes to the internet. Like saying, this information overload coming straight. I mean, every source at the moment, to the point that people make videos at the moment on YouTube, and they've got big numbers. It's just about them browsing the dark web, and it amazes how many people. I mean, sometimes, mostly it's just harmless crap,
Right.
just a fake hitman, which come give me some bitcoins. Blatant scam, obviously. But they're just getting millions and millions of views, these videos, and it's not just been around lately, but it's just people even looking into like watching that is like a little bit of like dipping your toe in the water.
Right.
Because you're like, oh, I'm going to watch, this little bit of content. I wonder what I could find, and bang, next thing they're getting sucked into some fucking vortex of horror.
Right. That you can't unsee or unknow. You're just in there.
And I mean, I've not really. I mean, it's mostly the Tor network. I've never been on that. I wouldn't even fucking. The fact that it's from like Russia, I'm like, no, I'm pretty good, thank you very much.
I have a boundary. You're like very aware.
Yeah, no, it's but these people that they end up going down these rabbit holes, and some people are just fucked them for life. And it's also about the content as well. There's lots. Like I said, there's all this information coming at us all the time, but there's never really anything positive. We went from obviously the Black Lives Matter stuff to it's like issue to issue to issue, and even that's just come back up again lately because of the recent scams, and also the charity scam in the UK involving Sir Captain Thomas Moore, whatever his name was. Sorry, sir. I can't remember everyone's name on the planet. But there was a charity, and that woman got blatantly scammed and skimmed off the top, built a big hot tub in her back garden. And yeah, again, it's just these normal-looking people that you just wouldn't think. And I forgot where I was going with that, but it's my anger for that woman. It's this charity and that, But these people as well, they're just So from that. The Black Lives Matter stuff to that, COVID, and there's just now wars, bang, another war, and then, the Ukraine stuff, and now obviously in Israel. And it's just that in itself's an information overload for people to just go, I can't be asked for any of this. What path do I go down? There's nothing really positive. And I think that's also another reason why, there's more content ever of just people stealing. There's people out there that are teaching people to go robbing on TikTok,
Wow.
and that it's happening in the UK. Shoplifting, how to shoplift. What a great, and that's getting millions of views. But there's just not much positive in the world lately. It's, you know, where do people go from here? And that's
Right.
sort of what I'm constantly thinking all the time. Especially, you know, you got kids, so you've got kids that are young, especially if they're young. You know, people need to start thinking about what's around them and really start. Not many people are looking at crazy content or conspiracies, but people have got to start doing it because they're not going to be able to open their eyes at all. You know.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a great opportunity for like balance as well. And I don't mean like work-life balance or
No.
some corny concept like that, but more of with dark and light. You know, it's both. This world has both, and it's true. We can, you know, we can go into these really deep rabbit holes where it's too dark, it's too much, and then you know, I feel like people are so lost in that they don't even have the ability to stop and think and reflect and ask themselves, why am I looking at this, participating in this? Why am I doing this? It's very compulsion. It's like a compulsion, you know, at some point for a lot of people. But if they really do start to sort of become self-reflective, there will be these little openings. And I do think that's where that magic that we are kind of talking about a little bit finds its way back in. I was just talking about this recently with someone where we were kind of joking around because my husband will do this thing that frustrates the shit out of me, where like if you ever have those one of those moments where you're trying to remember something and it's like
All the
right
time.
there and you know it's right there and you're just waiting for it to come in, and then they're like, let's Google it, let's look it up. I'm like, no, I want the satisfaction of that little piece of information landing in my mind again. I want that's wonder. And we're not learning, we're not wondering, we're allowing things to give us our instant answers and feedback. And so that little piece of wonder, and I'm not saying this in like this sort of woo-woo way, but more of just thinking about those beautiful moments in life usually happen because we've created a little space for them. So if we're constantly consumed by whether it's the media, our own minds, whatever it might be, we're not allowing those moments. And I think for our children, it's essential to cultivate that within them, not have them be sort of delusional to the world not being the best place either, but those balances of dark and light. And if we had a hard day, can we round it out with something that is just helping to lighten that a little bit for each other? And I think that's where I'm feeling called to do both. It's, I don't want to deny that this exists because I came out of a world that did that. I was living in this for decades. I was a part of like these different spiritual communities, personal development, whatever you want to sort of call that. And don't get me wrong, there's enormous value and life-changing things happening there. But there's a lot of like disassociation, disconnection, spiritual bypassing, toxic positivity. There's a whole lot also going on where people are so afraid to turn within themselves that they're reaching externally. And so I feel like part of the reaching is those rabbit holes that we can also find ourselves in. So if we can just find ways to bring wonder in, and that doesn't have to be some fantastical thing. It can just simply be a walk in the woods, a break from being online, you know, even just engaging with our children and just, you know, what's in your mind? What are you thinking? One of my favorite things to do, I do it with adult clients, but it's great for kids too, is like if you can't express something or you don't know what's going on, find a fairy tale, like an old school eerie one, to tell the story for you. And psychologically, it will reflect different parts of what's going on for us if we choose to play with it in that way. But there's so many creative ways that we can bring that back in, but we have to be willing to do that instead of distracted by all the things that are trying to rob us of the one beautiful thing we have, which is our minds, you know, our ability to think and feel and express. And if we're outsourcing that, that's dangerous. That's kind of frightening.
Well, this is where, you know, it goes back to just being a bit of a vessel. You know, it's the same. We're also a vessel of information all the time,
Mhm.
internally and externally. You know, a lot of people, you know, when they get anxiety, hate it. I don't mind it, to be quite honest. You know, I use it as like forward thinking.
Mm.
And most of it's just all bullshit, you know. I'll be lying there at night and my, you know, it's just ticking
Yep.
away. I'll practically sleep with headphones on just for that purpose, and then they'll fall off. Okay, and then I'll admit I'll say sorry right now. If I phone you in the night, anyone, that's what it is. I accidentally phoned up my one of my best friend's girlfriend at like 3 in the morning the other day, which was just because he phoned me on her phone. His was dead, and I, you know, it's got like a little button and went, did it. You know, it's a good job with best mates and they live miles away. But you know, it's stuff like that that you got to enjoy in life. But you know, that came from a night's worth of anxiety, and then going, oh, I'm just going to put my headphones on, and then you know, you laugh about it the next day.
Yeah.
It is a lot of forward planning in my head. You know, most of it's all, you know, revolves around my show and stuff like that. It's all absolute nonsense. Just going, man, did I get this notes right? Did I do that? And it's just, but it's all stuff that I'm technically then learning from, because the next time I'll go, oof, remember that? I sat there and thought about that for like 8 hours last night.
Yep.
And we didn't, you know. But so I'll end that little bit. Otherwise, I'll go down my own rabbit hole of self reflection and then sit there tonight going, damn, we shouldn't have done that one. But no, you are right. You know, just going back to the personal development, the spirituality, you know, I've also been caught up in that. I like going through it as well. You know, I've got a few certs and stuff, but not 30. That's crazy. So let's just go and obviously you're an author. I love speaking to authors. Best-selling author. Your books, nudges from your spirit. I'll get that correct.
Yeah.
I'm also terrible at naming the books, by the way. I do it every show. I got one wrong once, I swear. And the Wild Women series. Let's get into those. What made you want to become an author?
You know, it's interesting. I was kind of the resistant author. I didn't really want to be an author. I just wanted to write. I just wanted to express myself. I had been writing since I was like 5 or 6 years old, not quality or anything, but just writing. And it was just something that couldn't be stopped. I don't know. I don't know how to explain that, but there's something about this creative impulse as a writer for me that needs a way out. And I discovered when I was probably in my late teens, early 20s, that not only should I chase that impulse or allow that impulse, because it's usually pretty healthy. And sometimes it was just journaling kind of stuff, you know, like all the stuff you're talking about, the anxiety and being up at night and all those things. I too have the same thing. And I learned that just having a journal, my own personal, not really a diary, but a notebook where I could just write this stuff out.
Do you
seemed to be
ever
something.
do like a do you ever do like a dream journal?
Yes.
I was gonna ask it later, but I thought while you're on the
Yeah,
topic of writing.
absolutely. That's essential, actually, because I do a lot of Jungian dream analysis, and so the dream journal is essential for that. But yeah, that's where it all kind of started. And then what I realized is I was doing these sessions with clients, and so I don't do it as much anymore, but I used to work with people one on one for a long time, and I noticed that just sharing that with them, sharing the journaling technique or some of my thoughts, it helped them on some level. And so people would say, well, why don't you put that together into something, or how can I read more of that? And that's really where becoming an author became a bit more solidified and professional, realizing, you know what, I thought this was just about me, and now I'm realizing that there's something in this that might be helpful to another person. And if it's just one other person, then I'm all for it. Because it comes so naturally for me to write. The content isn't easy for sure. Like diving into yourself in that way and sharing it's unnerving. You know, it takes courage to basically unburden your heart and soul and then let other people read that, because sometimes you're like, who wrote this
And
nonsense?
judge you as well. You know,
Right.
everyone's a critic. You know.
Oh, for sure. For sure. So yeah.
um, Obviously, what is the Wild Woman series?
So it's a series that I started a few years back. We have 2 books, might possibly have a third one coming out. The idea was that when I wrote my first book, I had so many questions around the process, not even just the content, but how does this work? And what I kept hearing over and over again from my clients, from my students was, oh, I wish I could do that, but I don't have the courage to do that, or to put my story out there. And some people just felt like they didn't have a whole, a book's worth of content. They might have just had a memory of a story or something that they felt was really essential. So I decided to work with my friend who's a publisher and put this series together to help other women basically express themselves. So they were able to share, it worked out to be a chapter per person, but there was different themes. And so each book has a different theme, and they were their stories, their rituals, their different practices, meditations, things like that, based on that theme. So the first book it's called the Book of Shadows, but really what that means is like, if you've ever done anything for yourself that has worked, that might help someone else, let's put that into a process, into a formula, into something that you could write and that somebody'd understand. That's what that whole first book is. And so it might be things on helping people to heal from, some type of mental affliction or something like that. Others, it's stories of growth or expansion. And then the second book, very similar, except it revolved around the topic of prosperity, because so many people are hung up around money, prosperity. It's something that we just have to make peace with. We need it while we're here on this planet, regardless of what you believe. Like, everybody needs it. But how we view it, how we work with it, how we let it control us, all of those things can shift. And so the women in that book wrote those kind of stories or shared those types of practices. Like, you know what, this helped me when I was broke, or this helped me when I was feeling really bad about my financial situation or my debt or whatever. And then there's other people that recognize that prosperity isn't even just about money. And so they talk about that. So both books I'm incredibly humbled by the women that participated in that project and shared their stories, because they're so different. And something that a lot of people don't know about those books is that when we published them, each one of those stories, none of the women were allowed to share the stories with each other until the final book was ready. And the reason that we did that was we didn't want them to get into their heads and get focused in like the comparison part of it, like who's doing what,
Yeah.
and is my story good enough, that nonsense. And they even said like it was the most magical thing for them to not know what was going on, and triggering too, because it certainly brought up a lot of really uncomfortable feelings for them as they went through that process. But what they realized is when it was done, that they trusted themselves, they said what they needed to, and when it came out, it was just incredible, because they didn't know ahead of time what anybody else was going to do. All they knew was they had their parameters, they had the logistics of the project, and the idea of the theme. And then we did some trainings around that, saying, here's what you can do, what you can't do, here's some things to consider. And then each woman, just in her own way, went and did her thing, did her writing, and came back. We had it all edited, compiled, and it was they're emotional projects. It's, the first time you see your name in print, or you see this story that other people are now going to read, it changes you. And it really does. It changes something in you. And like you said, that you could be judged, or all of this stuff comes up, and you just learn, back to the idea of that soul, you just learn to trust that whatever was needing to move through you in that way, that you did your job and you let it go. And if there's haters, if there's people judging it or shaming it or tearing it apart, that is a reflection of them, not your person, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good process. Especially, I mean, most writers nowadays, they all get together, excuse me, and then they talk crap, which does lead to that. You get X amount of people in the room whose story is the best, and it does create this sort of competition in a way. And not only that, embellishment as well. You
Right.
know, I mean, whenever we tell a story, I've told a story before, and I'm not overly embellished it, but you change minor details just for
Yeah.
comedic value. Um, it's not very often, because sometimes I create these crazy situations myself, which are fucking ridiculous. So I don't really need to ever embellish them that much. If anything, I embellish it and tone it down a little bit.
Right.
Um,
Make it safe for print or for media consumption.
yeah, but but that's what people do naturally anyway. People love telling stories, but
Right.
if it's a good way to not have any bias as well, because
Yes.
people could then look at it and judge it and go, yeah, well, you just got all those women together in a room, and then you all sit there and pre-planned it, you did this. Whereas if you're going, well, actually, no, this was the process.
Right.
There was no prior contact, da da da. And then obviously that's good that you got them all together at the end to then go through that. I bet that really was a very powerful experience.
Yeah. It was
Um,
emotional. It was very emotional. A lot of these people are first time authors too. So it's, there's some women that participated in that project that had a few other books or other things, they've been published in. But I'd say probably 80% of both of those books were brand new authors who were terrified and just willing. And there's something incredibly powerful about that really, I don't know. I feel very proud but humbled at the same time that they trusted me to put that together, because that's a vulnerable position to be in, to
yeah,
hand over your heart basically and say, okay, now not only are you going to publish this for who knows how many people are going to see it, but also before you publish it, you're going to rip it apart and edit it, So I mean, it's not really that dramatic in this case because the editor is very generous and understands how vulnerable that is. So it wasn't like complete rewrites of things or anything. There's that fear.
yeah.
There's that fear that when I hand this over to the editor, they're going to tear it apart and make it unrecognizable, which is another reason that we did this project. It's because my friend that helped publish Transcendental Publishing, I can never say it, her whole her ethics, her ethos, everything around it is about telling the story and getting into the heart of things. So there's ethics, there's morals, there's integrity there that we knew could be we could hold that within this project instead of handing it over to a bigger publisher and kind of crossing your fingers and going, we don't know what's going to come back. We wanted these women to feel safe that what they explored, expressed, was going to be very closely held to their same voice through that editing process too.
It would make a really interesting like short film, do like a Sundance-esque thing.
Hmm.
I'm a really big fan of like independent films.
Yeah.
Mostly where there's like one guy in a room and that's pretty much it. Occasional character. Whereas that would make a really interesting. You're all sat around, blah 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 blah. You know what I mean? Almost like an AA-esque kind of. And then obviously each person would have a little story, a little tale. That'd be pretty cool. Like
That,
almost like you get the horror film like VHS where it's all separate little things,
yeah.
but obviously no horror element. And there's
That's
no and no, they're not going into the house and finding a weird old man and whatever. But you know what I mean. If you sort of
yeah.
cross the VHS, not the VHS vibe, but that format of short stories,
Yeah.
and it'd be a really cool, project.
You're the second person that actually recommended that. That's interesting. Somebody else said the same thing when we first came out with the first book, and they were like, "You should probably consider doing something with this because it's quite emotional." And then when you watch those women talk about it, you feel it. It's back to that like empathy, connection, soulfulness. Because not only do we do the book, but then in order to promote and sell the book, to have that whole bestseller experience, we do a launch party kind of a situation, and not everyone participate, but most of the authors who felt comfortable enough to did a Facebook Live or some type of a live experience where for about 30 minutes each one talked about their chapter. They talked about what it was like for them, and it was amazing because they're not just the beauty of what it is they were talking about, but what I found really interesting is so many of them, the way they came across the project, even just to say, so and so told me about this and I just knew I had to be a part of it. And I was like, wow, there was almost like this deeper impulse within them that was like, I don't even know what this is, but I need to do it. I found that fascinating because I was like, man, there's that, I don't know. It's back to that idea of like you can't capture that, but you can certainly feel it when it's present.
I mean, did you ever keep the Google recordings? Because
Yeah,
that'd be an interesting one to compile them. Because even then, you've also, you could compile them. You've also got like a documentary behind it.
yeah, that's a great idea. Actually. Yeah, we have the recordings for sure.
I mean, it's just one of those because it definitely brings, especially at the moment as well. You know, going back to what's going on in the world at the moment. You know, the, the whole trans thing is a very big issue at the moment, but it really women fought so goddamn hard to just get a few steps up this fucking ladder, and a lot of crazy men out there are kind of fucking it up. And it's just lonely men, you know, going back to where people went during COVID.
Right.
Some of these, you know, a lot of these sick weirdos got into this whole different level of game.
Yeah.
I don't know, you know, I think I know some of the mentality behind it. Um, only just from watching thousands and thousands of videos. But it's just, you know, at the moment, it's a very big hot topic, and it's hard to kind of not talk about it without getting any shit, but I don't really care anyway. I mean, in the UK, there's real fucking libel laws and shit like that, so I don't really care, fuck it. But, you know, what, especially going back to the empowering thing, I think that a lot of people, you know, women need a lot more empowerment now.
Yeah.
It's getting really taken away gradually, bit by bit, and it's not it's not every trans person, but it's this kind of weird sort of subgroup that is just really just hitting it full force. I don't even understand why it's happening. What should sort of your thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh, there's so much around it. I feel like the idea of empowerment and disempowerment, because that's kind of like the two, right, sort of
Yeah,
opposing
come
forces.
hand in hand.
Yeah, it's I don't want to say it isn't happening because it certainly is happening, but I also think there's a little bit of illusion in there where there are very real horrible things that happen, and I feel like there's an amplification of that to make some things also feel worse through the media or whatever, government, whatever you want to call that. Um, to create more of that disempowered feeling or experience. I think things are skewed in a way where it's to exaggerate and intensify. And so I feel like this is just coming back around again too. We've got to learn how to trust ourselves and anchor really deeply into who we are, and build that, right? Build and become more resilient in who we are. Otherwise, it's nearly impossible to sift through what is true, what is not true, who's doing this, what group is doing this, or what's happening. And when it comes down to it, I feel like it's too big. And what I tend to do is like, how can I break all of that down into person by person? Who is in front of me? How are we connecting, engaging? What's going on? How are they feeling? Um, I do think that individuals are obviously individuals will make up the group of whatever it is. And so case by case, situation by situation, we can encourage people to really do their inner work, whatever that is. It is going to impact things. It's just the challenge with that is the people that need the help don't always know they need the help. Especially because sort of what you're talking about also when it comes to media, government, it's staggering how many people those positions of power, the toxic masculine is often what it's called, patriarchy. And believe me, women do it too. So it certainly isn't just all on men. And those really toxic individuals there's a lot of narcissism, there is a lot of psychopathy. They're really good at getting into those positions because they have less care about what it takes to get them there. That emotional piece, right, is disengaged again, and not for everyone, but for a lot of them. And so it makes it easier to climb on people, step on people when you're not looking down to see the mess you're creating. So I think there's a lot of that. And I think taking any of that on is just so big. It's overwhelming, and honestly, I'll just be honest and say, when I think about all of that, I feel a bit defeated. I don't even know where to begin. I don't know how to contribute. I just trust that part of me, whether again soul, my deeper self, whatever, just keep saying, like, keep showing up, having these conversations and leading people back to themselves if they can be. If they're open to that, if they're well enough mentally to be able to make that a priority. And the more that we trust ourselves, the more that we can sort of dismantle some of the illusions of what we think is happening and not happening, the more we sift through the nonsense and just really become more self-informed. And when you're really self-informed and you're trusting and you work with others, you do form groups, you still come together, you still connect, but it's very different. It's no longer like this blind leading the blind. It's, you know, when you get one solid grounded person, you can feel the difference in their leadership versus someone who's disempowered and using fear to control. Worlds apart. They are worlds apart in their presence and their energy and how they communicate. They take personal responsibility for what's working, what's not working. So I think there's a lot of things that we can observe without allowing ourselves to be pulled into it. And for me, that's sort of where my practice is right now. How can I observe this? If I'm activated by it, upset by it, triggered by it, I'm going to pay attention more because there's something going on. But how can I gain a little clarity in what I'm feeling instead of making assumptions, projecting on someone else? You know, we have it's kind of like, I don't know when this started, but the whole thing around cancel culture and all of that, I don't think people realize how that's hurting themselves in a way. And it's just like everything, there's shadow and light, right? There's a double-edged side to this. There are certain people that it worked for, that we needed to be canceled, that we needed to bring things to light, to shift, you know, Me Too movement, all of that kind of stuff.
Of course.
But there's a lot of people that jump on those things also to use it and weaponize it. And that's where we're not clear. And that's where I sort of observe more than engage and dialogue in those ways. I try to observe because I see both happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. I had like 3 points in my head, but I'll go to the last one just because it's more fresh. Obviously, the Me Too thing, that's probably where, you know, I said earlier, you know, we had all these big events. That was definitely one that was absolutely great. And I believe that was really empowering for women. But I believe that was kind of where the slippery slope of society then started to somehow, I don't know why or how, I don't know how it even managed to happen, because then all of a sudden it went just this big influx of this, like I said, there's all these trans people, not all of them are bad, but it's just all these lonely, sad old men that have never really got a single bit of attention, and now they're getting welcomed into a group based upon just, well, just looks, really. It's not even really based upon anything else. But it's kind of it's strange because during that moment, you know, again, the first person I believe to get cancelled was Harvey Weinstein.
Mm-hmm.
But what's strange is he's not really cancelled, because you can still go and watch any one of his films.
True.
He's not really making new films,
Right.
but that don't really matter. Most films that go under that was it New Line? I don't know which one it was. New Line Cinema, it might have been. I think so. I don't know. But there's tons and tons of films, so it's almost impossible to cancel that guy,
Right.
because there's a million. Excuse me. You know, there's like Scary Movie, one of the biggest comedies of all time.
Right.
Under what company? The Weinstein Company. You know.
Yeah, you can't pull that back in. You can't take that away. And I think that's part of the, okay, how do we move forward then with this? And, you know, cancel what or to basically cut off any type of further influence those things could have, I guess, in a way of what's the baseline? Where are we at? And okay, we start with the human, you know, let's start with that human being, and they're taken care of essentially. But now the body of work, you know, it's really that's a tricky subject, because I feel like it isn't just an isolated thing, and that's part of that problem. If it were just him being the only star in one of those movies, it'd be way easier. Kind of like the example with R. Kelly, right? How like it was almost easier in a way, because you have, even though there's other people involved in the production of music and film and all of that, it's a little easier to focus in on a singular human and just stop playing that song than all of these actors and actresses and people and all that. You know, it's tricky. It's difficult. It's not like taking that one piece of artwork off the wall because you don't like the artist anymore. it's really deep. It's messy. And I don't know, I have this little part of me that's also kind of like, maybe it's important not to on another level, not to celebrate those people or to
I know
um
where you're getting at.
yeah, but it's sort of like we don't want to also erase things that we can learn from, that we can do better with. If we keep just denying and taking away all the things that make us uncomfortable, we're just going to keep meeting ourselves on the path anyway, right? On in the world. And so why not use them to inform in a different way, just like we should be with certain parts of history? We should be using these things to inform, to show not how to do
Of
something,
course.
where we were blind, where we were wrong. And I think people are so afraid to do that because of the shame and the guilt that they've buried really deeply within themselves, instead of saying, like, yeah, we really jacked that scenario up, made the biggest mess out of it. But moving forward is, how do we untangle and do better in all these different ways? That's my personal feeling about it.
Well, I mean, the other thing is, I was my second point, and now come into my head during that thing, is when these people get into groups as well, is no one really can disagree with each other, and
Yeah,
disagreement is a big thing. The only people that they're disagreeing with is other different people outside of a group,
right.
and that I don't think that's kind of where society's fucking up a bit.
It's
I've never seen at the moment anybody really from the same group go at it unless it's been for a comedic YouTube boxing match. It's all been fake. But whereas meanwhile, there's all these little factions of society that are just like going at it, tearing each other apart. Whether it's orchestrated, who knows? Um, but that was just the second point. I can scrap that off now. I just wanted to make sure that I sort of put that out there. So let's just talk about. Obviously, I'm going to go back to teaching. I was going through your website, fantastic website by the way, and I came across shadow work. What is that?
Oh, I love this topic. There's a lot of, oh, okay, where do I begin? So let's start with the origin of this. So shadow work, when I describe it or talk about it, it's coming from a very Jungian influence, the work of Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst who
Yep.
contributed to this idea of the shadow. And he called it the shadow self. And it was a very dimensional, hazy, interesting part of our persona, again, our psyche, not our persona, but our psyche, which includes the persona, includes the shadow, includes the collective consciousness and the collective unconscious, all of these different elements, basically. And so shadow work is when we learn how to work with the abandoned, rejected, different parts of self, when we are dealing with something and deciding to work with it instead of turn away from it. Shadow work is also, it's tricky, because if you think you're doing shadow work, then you might be fooled. So it's very like trickster. It's a very trickster like kind of an experience. It's not something where it's like, I'm going to do shadow work, so I'm going to sit down on Monday morning and get out my journal and I'm going to write about this. Shadow work happens when we're in traffic and we're screaming at someone or cutting them off. Shadow work happens when somebody upsets us and we learn how to contain ourselves and be like really anchored in who we are. It's a matter of finding ways to express ourselves authentically, but with this realization that we've got deeper things within us. The other thing too is, it's not always a negative experience. So shadow is, think of it this way. So your ego is the gatekeeper within your psyche. So in a way, what that means is, anything that we're aware of means that we're conscious of it. We can see it, we can know it, we understand it. The ego is the barrier between our conscious awareness and this hidden, deeper world within. The ego is responsible for what it allows up into that zone of knowing. And so the shadow is beneath all of that. So the way that we can experience shadow is when the ego allows these impulses to come up. And one of the ways it does it is it allows us to see these things we don't like in someone else. So
Right.
it's usually kind of mirrored back to us, right, in this really creative way. So one of the ways that we do shadow work is by saying, okay, pick somebody in your world that you absolutely can't stand, that drives you crazy. And I'm talking like there's an emotional charge, not just, yeah, I don't like that guy. You know, it's like I use Charles Manson as an example, right? Like I wouldn't have let him into my living room and sat
Of
down and had
course.
a meal with the guy, but I'm also not emotionally charged because he didn't do anything to me personally, right? So that's not really shadow work. That's more just like I can say, no, I wouldn't trust this person to come into my home or be in my life or spend my time and energy with them. But it is to think about like the people who we have this really intense sort of reaction to. That's something where we can get a hint of shadow breaking into our awareness to say, what's going on here? Why is this bothering me so much? Why am I so upset by this? And again, it's not a negative. So it's allowing us to see something that's invisible within us that can only be sort of mirrored in the outer world. But there's a positive to this, which is the same thing happens. Let's say with jealousy or admiration. You can also maybe follow somebody online or listen to their podcast and want to do your own thing and be like, man, I just love how this person does this. They've put it together, they've got their shit together, and I admire that. The same thing. So, technically, some of those qualities that you really admire in someone else are in your shadow, and they just haven't made it into conscious awareness yet. Or maybe you haven't developed or cultivated those skills just yet. But when we really admire someone, and again with that emotional charge to it, or we want to do something and we don't feel confident yet, and there's this deep feeling of like, why do I want this if I can't have it? That's shadow work. So it's the untapped potential, the unmanifest skills, gifts, and talents that we have available to us. So it isn't just the ugly repressed things, although that's part of it. It's also the things that we have yet to become aware of about ourselves.
That's really interesting because I would never have thought that's what it was. Oh,
Mhm.
excuse me. It's something, I mean, it is like, so I know exactly what you mean. I wouldn't be able to verbally express it as good as you. Uh, I mean, I know exactly what you mean. It's, I wouldn't necessarily like to say I do that a lot. I tend to, again, I'm a bit of an introvert myself,
Mhm.
going back to the start of the show. Um, but I know the way in which I would behave in the real world, you know,
Mhm.
and I never behave like a dick in society. I behave like an idiot in this little one box. And it literally say all my foolishness mostly stays in here unless I'm playing with the kids, and then that's different, you know what I mean? But in normal everyday society, I'm like, there's kind of like unwritten rules that you have to live by.
Right.
And do you think that's sort of like the same sort of thing in a way? Or
Um, Yeah, I think the shadow is more when we all of a sudden realize we haven't been able to follow our own rule. So, like
right,
for example, it's usually got this feeling of intensity to it. It can be a compulsion. Addiction has a lot of shadow in it, right? A lot of behavior that's sort of like I want to do this, but I'm doing this and I can't stop. That's a lot of shadow. The thing, and addiction is really more of just the manifestation of other things going on, right? When you treat addiction or look at it, you're really looking at other stuff: anxiety, depression, stress, trauma, whatever that might be. There's a lot of shadow in that too. And it just means unknown, unprocessed. It could be unmet needs. But yeah, I do feel like naturally in the world, if you're someone who is just even mildly self aware, we're always doing shadow work, always. It's just that it can take a little bit more of a grounded individual to say, okay, you know what, I've had this repetitive pattern in my life and I'm tired of it. I want to do something about it. And then working on that with someone that can see things in you. And this is what I love. It's like you can part of the magic and the mystery of the shadow is that when you work with it, it's always easier to see things in other people than it is in ourselves. We can see a lot of stuff within ourselves for sure, but others can point things out. So I have some of my clients or students do this little simple exercise where I'll be like, okay, I want you to write down on a piece of paper what you think your shadow is, the things you don't like, the things you avoid, the things maybe
Right. Got you, got
deny.
you, got you.
And then I'll say, now I want you to go pick 3 people that you trust, a friend, a family member, ask them what they think your blind spots are. And you'll just be like, phew. Because what happens is usually those other people, if you feel safe with them, if you trust them, they will say things that are probably very similar in what they view that comes through your personality that you may not be aware of. And it just shows us that not only are we so dimensional in our presence and in the world, but that people do see these patterns and connections within us that we might be blind to. We see this a lot, let's say, even at a distance online. Recently I was having this conversation with my husband where I'm a Mets fan. I don't admit that very much publicly because, well, we're used to disappointment.
Go nuts.
But I'm a
Go
baseball.
nuts.
So we were having this conversation about a particular individual, on the team or whatever. And it was interesting because we could see these things that were going on from a distance. I don't know this person. I don't know anything about them except for what is publicly put out there. But there was this series of events that had occurred where, to me, I could see very clearly this was a pattern. So to the outside world, to people that are observing us, they can actually see more of our shadow than we can sometimes see within ourselves. It's interesting. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's funny because when I looked at it and I seen shadow work, it immediately makes me think of shadow, what you're casting on the wall.
Yeah.
But it's also the same sort of thing. You almost see it in like cartoons where there's like a shadow and it'll turn evil.
Yes. There's a darkness to it. There's this dimension.
Or well, I'll go back to a horror reference. Killer Clowns from Outer Space. The clown, his reflection on the wall, laughing at him, and his shadow ends up, the mild Halloween reference for people. But it just made me think of the same thing. Not many people really do it. I mean, it's almost like a light form of judgment. It seems like, in a way, mixed with like neuro-linguistic programming.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
It's almost, that's sort of the impression it casts in my head, where I'm like, well, or maybe like auditing in a way, like self-auditing.
Yeah.
Not like the way in which the Church of Scientology does it, but
Right.
yeah. But I mean, if you're looking at yourself, you go, okay, this is good, and then getting somebody else to do it as well. I've got tons of flaws, but I know the ones that I have. But I could be in a room with. I would like to be in a room with 10 people and go point out one of my flaws.
Right.
Because it'd be interesting to get 10 people's different takes.
Yeah.
One of them, I would imagine that a few of them would say smoking. That is, so many people. Again, I'll say that just because I'm actually going to. But it's one of those things. Everyone's got a little bit of judgment to themselves.
Yeah.
But I think that it's needed.
It is. I think it's essential. It's not all bad. There's even just using the example of smoking. I smoked for years, and I worked with this woman. I called her like my elder. She's like this amazing medicine woman. It was very typical, like something you would see on television. She like lived in the middle of the desert, and I would go visit her and work with her. And I remember I was a smoker and I just felt so torn. I felt like really bad about that. I'm like, I don't want to smoke. And I feel like I'm judged for it. And everybody, it's like such a dirty thing, right? All the things that you hear. And then she asked me this really wonderful question. And she's like, well, what do you think it does for you? And I listed your typical stuff like the nicotine and the makes me feel better or whatever. And she said something I didn't expect. And she was like, but how does it protect you? I'm like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, when you smoke, she was very intuitive. So she would get this little sort of thing in her mind. She was like, I feel like it puts this smoke screen around you.
Interesting.
And it allows you to sort of have your own bubble or space. And she's like, but it was interesting because she didn't know about me that I was very introverted. I mean, she probably saw some of those qualities in me, but we didn't really communicate or talk about it. But the other thing is, I felt so socially awkward that it was something I could do that gave me something physical to do while around others. So even if they were smoking or not smoking, there was something about it that I didn't know I was getting in that way. And when she expressed that, there was something about just thinking that, even considering that, I started back to the shadow work. I started thinking about, well, why would I want to have this around me? What is this doing for me? And then it helped me to start digging deeper into myself and realizing I didn't really feel safe in experiences. I didn't feel comfortable being myself. And that was sort of what I was suppressing. And so, and I'm not saying that's every smoker, every situation, but even just that simple thing of someone outside of me reflecting a possibility of a different way of seeing it, all of a sudden I didn't feel as much guilt and shame. Eventually I did ended up quitting. And I think I quit with more ease around it than I would have if I didn't deal with some of the other stuff going on. But yeah, judgment is a huge piece of it. And that's shadow too, because often the people that are judging have no business doing right? Like they're not
Right.
walking in our shoes. They don't know what it feels like to be us. They have their own stuff they're clearly ignoring and avoiding. So it's, but it is interesting. And it would be cool to see what would happen if you were to get 10 people to just share, their thoughts. And the thing is, it's not even just to say like, oh, here I'm a sinner, right? If we use religious like terminology, I'm a sinner, here's all the things I do wrong. It's actually we approach it with curiosity. So instead of shaming or blaming or judging, we look at it like with curiosity, saying something like, I wonder what that's about. Like, I haven't thought about the fact that I did A, B, C, or D. I wonder why. I wonder what's under that. And so it's this question of, I wonder what's under that. And you just sort of keep going. And I feel like the closer you get to the charge, the more resistance there can be, a little pushback. It can get ugly. The shadow can get really ugly. Um, but for me, it's been more this sense of relief like, wow, this thing I hated or I pushed against so much within myself is actually unfolding some really cool shit. And I'm so grateful that this horrible thing turned into this great thing. And you hear this all the time, but I feel like it's very different when you take the journey through it. When you really sink into the details and start to realize there's some magic tucked within this darkness. And I never would have found it if I didn't decide to turn around and look at it,
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, again, I'm an introvert myself, and I've smoked since I was like 13. Successfully quit twice. Successfully, It's funny when people say that because it's like, how do you successfully quit twice? But everyone says that, and they go, "Yeah, I successfully quit twice." I'm like, but you're still smoking.
Right.
Of course. It's like one of those phrases that people say, so I kind of adopt it myself. But it's funny that you mentioned like these environments because I started in school again socially, and it's funny as well because even when people go out drinking and that don't smoke, I know people that don't smoke at all. They go out for a drink and all of a sudden they've become smokers,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it's there's that social aspect to it. But it's funny that you mentioned the smoke screen around yourself because it's I kind of feel that way if I was to think, if I was to sit here for, maybe about an hour,
Yeah.
I'd probably be able to easily convince myself that is a really justifiable reason as to why I do smoke. Because obviously I'm on camera, this don't mean shit, it's not like there's a big social setting. But the times that I've stopped was prior to me teaching kids. I used to teach kids outdoor activities with one of my long-standing friends. And well, that was vaping, wasn't really smoking, but I'd quit and then started there, and I was like, man, it's just fucking stressful. Long days. So I started vaping again after that job, going back home. I'm like, this vape is rubbish. Going back to cigarettes. But it's all, it's like again, social pressures. It's strange how your mind it takes a lot of real willpower.
Yeah.
Same for alcoholism. Takes a hell of a lot of willpower to not go back, into that. I don't know if you'd say, would you say in terms of this? So obviously you mentioned about the shadow, and I made a little joke earlier, further closer to the wall you go, it gets more it go more evil. But
Mhm.
obviously, but if you're there on a light day and you was to stand against a wall and move further back, obviously the shadow's a bit more faded, there's less
Mhm.
contrast. Yeah, contrast. And obviously the closer you get, the shadow's a bit more deeper. Would you say that it's kind of like that as a crappy analogy?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great analogy. I would add to it and just say I feel like the bigger the shadow or the more intense it is maybe, and I can't prove this, but it's just a thought. Maybe the closer we are to our deeper human instincts and compulsions, and less oriented towards the self. Because and again, this would be reflective of the framework of Jung's idea of the psyche, which I just happen to resonate with. I don't think it's the end all be all to explain everything, but I do think it makes a lot of sense where when we start out in life, when we're born, everything is about the outer world and kind of has to be, right? We have to rely to be fed, to be taken care of. Our attention is on external figures, parents, what have you. But what happens as we grow is that deeper inner knowing our individual nature. Who are we separate from them? That starts to create a shift. And if we don't start to choose the deeper self instead of just pleasing everybody else or living for everybody else, there's usually some type of event that happens. There's some impactful moment. We might hear it as the hero or the heroine's journey, right? In like psychology, when we talk about that kind of a thing. And I feel it's very true. There's some symbolic gesture in life that happens that says what you thought it was isn't that, and starts to shift. And what that happens psychologically is the ego begins to imagine like the sun on the horizon sinking into the water. That's kind of very symbolic of what the ego starts to do. It goes deeper inward. It reorients itself from the outer world to the inner world. So essentially, as we go more into the inner world, the challenge with that is we become closer to instinct and compulsion, and our very primal ways that are hardwired in us. And think of the parts of the brain, the limbic system, that are very much activated in this old primal way of survival. So we also have to contend with that. So when I feel like the standing near the wall and just having that, really, actually, it's a powerful image to think about how deep the shadow is or intense. We're also working with that too at the same time. So someone that's self-aware does not have it easier. I feel like it's harder for that person because you're more aware of the stuff that other people are just keeping down here because they're still oriented to the outer world. So that's part of it. And I also think that, just adding in that layer of like the psychopathy and all of that, I feel like they're more consumed by instinct, and so there is a really deep shadow there. The idea of self isn't really anchored into anything, and if it is, it's very much about it being transactional. How can people be used as a tool or an object to get that person ahead in life versus empathy, connection. And when you're more oriented towards your deeper self or soul, whatever you want to call that part, you think of others as well. You take care of you, and you've got to, and you think about others. And so the shadow is really, it'll show up in the most sneaky and interesting of ways. But I think that's a great metaphor. And just one other thing I'll just say real quick is you mentioned evil, and just slightly a little bit. I have this really fantastic quote that one of my professors shared. His name's Dr. Glenn Slater, and he said, "Evil isn't. It's not really what we think it is. Evil isn't dark, or darkness isn't evil. Let me make sure I get it right. Darkness isn't evil. Darkness is evil is what happens when we don't confront our darkness." And I love that.
That's
That
interesting.
right. It was like, wow, there's something to that. And I'm not saying again it sums up the world of evil, but I do think there's something to think about in that, is that when things are not dealt with, whether
That's
that's whatever, right? They will grow or get worse, become a compulsion, become a habit, become a serial problem. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that, and there's another quote that was something like, what we deny in our shadow just grows in darkness. And I think that's true too. Darkness in itself is a beautiful, still space of solitude, of growth, of possibility. But if we're oriented more with the ego and the outer world, that can feel like a deep pit or a void, right? It's same place but different meaning, different orientation. So I feel like there's something around that, and it's very important with the shadow piece that there's a lot of misconceptions, and this is what I don't like about the spiritual world or the personal development world, is when they don't understand some of these basics ideas of how the mind works around this. They can think that it's important to embrace all of who we are, and I've been wrong saying that too. In my past, I would have been like, yeah, we should love all of who we are. I don't think that's true. I think that there's parts of us that are not meant to come online. There's parts of us that are not
100%.
meant to be activated. And we're seeing that play out in the world. Yes, they are parts of us. We can be observant of that and aware that it could take anything at any time for one of us to go off the rails. So no, we don't want to just open the door and welcome that in. But I think that's the beauty of the ego as this gatekeeper and helping these things that are also meant to stay in shadow to stay in shadow. So not everything is supposed to come up into conscious awareness either.
No, that's a really, really good point. Um, let's just ask one more little question, just going back.
Yeah.
Obviously, you said I was going to ask this at the end anyway,
Mhm.
just for my own personal intrigue. Um, you said that you sometimes show like thriller horrors to your students. So, what sort of recommendations for the spooky season would you give?
Oh my gosh, if you want some really good content for like thinking about some of the things that we've been talking about here. So we do film analysis. We do a lot of film analysis, or looking at the something called archetypes. We'll look at the archetypal figures or characters, the way they
Yep.
work together. So I have a couple favorites. One is the movie Seven. I
Okay.
don't know if you've seen Seven. It's
Yep.
it's fantastic because it just goes through these different levels of the psyche and how these impulses are acted out and how this person thinks they're on a mission but isn't really aware of the type of mission, right? So it's destructive. So there's that one. I love good old fashioned Halloween, Michael Myers. Just there's a lot of material there to think about and work with. And then another one that I'll say two more, and these are a little more intense. So I will just a little bit of a warning. The not remake, but the show Dahmer that was actually created,
Okay.
the series.
That was really, really good. Really
It's
good.
intense for obvious reasons. It's meant to be. But my fascination more with observing that material is I also read a few articles on what Evan Peters, the actor, went through portraying this person, because this is a real person, right? This isn't a fictional character. So there's that element of no matter what you do, you're not going to get out from under the fact that horrible things did happen.
Oh,
And what it did to his psyche taking on that role is quite fascinating. So if you do watch the series, I recommend go Google him and look up some of the articles on what it did to him, because that's something we should think about too, is what we take on, what we portray, how does it change us, what are the ways we return right into a normal way of being. And then the last one is, interestingly enough, Evan Peters is also connected to, is American Horror Story. I love some of the different ways they play with intensity and imagery and story. But my favorite one is, for some reason, it was a bit more overlooked when a lot of people talk about that series. It's called Red Tide. I'm not going to give it away for anybody that wants to check it out. But what I will say is it's fascinating in showing how we will outsource our creativity and make these sort of like Faustian bargains, like deal with the devil, and what happens and how it slips by so easily and things get out of control, and how important it is to learn how to be with our tension, our discomfort, our writer's block, and actually feel all of that and be with it. So that's probably one of my favorites, but I mean, I could go on and on. I've got so many that I love.
I'll give two. I'll give two. Just going, just because it's got the word American in it. There's a really, really good film called American Satan. It's about a band, and that goes into the music industry. Has to sort of make a deal with the devil.
Oh,
A
interesting.
lot of crazy shit goes on in that. Very interesting film. But one as a that's just an interesting film. But one I would recommend about the human psyche is Rosemary's Baby. Not Rosemary's Baby. Not Rosemary's Baby. I meant to say The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. My bad.
Okay. Yeah.
My bad. I don't know how I got those two mixed up
They're
there.
both great.
Yeah, they're both great, but that's a different version of the Human Psyche, the Rosemary's Baby. But if you want to look into the director of the Human Psyche, that would be, the Rosemary's Baby guy. But yeah, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, that's a pretty old school film, but a very, very dark time and a very interesting film I would recommend during the Halloween season. Well, listen, it has been really, really fun having you on the show. I invite you on if you ever want to come back on the show, if you've ever got anything to promote at any point. And yeah, it's been really, really fun talking to you. Thank you very much. Have you got anything that you want to quickly promote?
Right now I'm just working on a lot of shadow material. So I do have a 30-day experience coming up, starts on Halloween, goes really deep into the psychological. I mix in fairy tale. I mix in different ways to work with the shadow. I call it a somatic writing experience. So you basically read the material. It's about 20 minutes a day worth of effort. And then I bring you into this state where it activates different things for you to look at. And we play with themes like death and decay and really intense stuff like that, but it has purpose. That's something I'm really excited about.
Where can people find you? Where can they check out your content?
Sure. Just go to my website, melissacorter.com. It's probably the best place to start.
Well, perfect. This has been the Posthuman Podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Timothy Turner, and we've been here today with Melissa Kim Corter. Thank you very much, people. Hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you.